All right, guys, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today is my scouting report of Falcons fourth round center Drew Dalman out of Stanford.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Still going strong, however, on Twitter at FalcFans. And, of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is my scouting report of the Falcons' second fourth-round pick in Stanford center Drew Dalman. And we'll get into Dalman's strengths, weaknesses, how he projects to the NFL. And we'll also compare him quite a bit to Matt Hennessy, the Falcons' third-round pick from a year ago. But before we get into that, I do want to plug the Peacock and Williamson podcast, one of the national NFL shows on the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can get insight from NFL analyst Brian Peacock and former NFL scout Matt Williamson on every game, every team, and every move. And you can check out the Peacock and Williamson podcast on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts. And probably there's a good potential that as you guys hear this episode on this fine Thursday morning or afternoon, that I will be making an appearance on Peacock and Williamson either this Thursday or this Friday. So even more reason to subscribe to it. But, that being said, let's talk about Drew Dalman. And let's start things off talking a little bit about his background. His dad is Chris Dalman, a former sixth-round pick of the 49ers back in 1993, played 7 seasons with the 49ers. Then in 2000, Chris suffered a career-ending neck injury during training camp, got into coaching shortly thereafter, coaching as an assistant coach at his high school alma mater at Palma in Salinas, California. Then Jim Mora, the former Falcons head coach, brought him in as an assistant offensive line coach to Atlanta in 2005 and 2006, serving under offensive line coach Jeff Jagodzinski and then Tom Cable, respectively, with, of course, the great Alex Gibbs serving as a consultant for the offensive line in those years. And that was Dalman's only stint as an NFL coach. He went on to be an assistant at Stanford, coaching the offensive line under Jim Harbaugh the next 2 years before returning to the high school level at Palma, where he has been ever since, where he coached his son Drew, who attended Palma and then followed in his dad's footsteps, attending Stanford. Drew went on to start 22 games across 3 years at Stanford, 20 at center, 2 at right guard, notably back in 1999. And Chris Dalman's last years in San Francisco, they had this undrafted free agent offensive tackle out of East Carolina by the name of Dwayne Ledford. Ledford didn't last too long in the NFL, garnering 1 start across 5 NFL seasons before getting into coaching himself. And lo and behold, found himself as the current Atlanta Falcons offensive line coach, serendipity, as we call it. And, I know Ledford has been open saying post-draft that his connections with Drew's dad weren't much of a factor in the Falcons' evaluation process of Drew. And he's probably correct in saying that, but let's just say it probably didn't hurt Drew's chances that maybe Dwayne Ledford does associate him with his dad, who was a very good starter for the 49ers in the late 90s. Drew wearing his dad's old number probably doesn't enhance those associations either. And probably the main reason that Ledford likes Drew is not simply because of who his dad is, but because of his nastiness. If there is a theme in terms of the 2 offensive linemen that the Falcons drafted this year in Dalman and Jalen Mayfield, it's their ability to finish guys and get after guys playing to and potentially beyond the whistle. And so there's clearly a type that the Falcons, if this 2021 draft class has to say anything in terms of what they like in offensive line prospects, and we can presumably expect that to be a continued theme in the future when it comes to offensive linemen that this team may evaluate. And I think that finishing ability stands out because I think it's probably the biggest thing that separates Drew Dalman from Matt Hennessy, the players that the Falcons drafted in round 3 last year to be their sort of heir apparent to Alex Mack. And now Drew Dalman comes in to potentially challenge that. I think they're similar in a lot of ways, that they're undersized guys that may struggle against power, but they're ideally suited to play in an outside zone running scheme, which is what the Falcons will employ this year under Dwayne Ledford and Arthur Smith. They're not exactly the same player. And I'll come out and say up front that I think Drew Dalman is a tad bit better than Matt Hennessy, but I think in general they're sort of from the same genre of player in terms of prospects. And you see the sort of the high level traits that you ideally want in an outside zone center, but you question if the size is going to hold them back from reaching their ceilings in the NFL. And I think one of the things I said in my scouting report of Matt Hennessy last year was that I felt like Hennessy came out in a weaker center class and arguably got drafted a half or full round earlier than he probably normally would have been in a typical center class. And I think, you know, you'll probably hear people and probably have heard people say like, well, Hennessy was a 3rd round pick and Dalman's a 4th round pick, so Hennessy's clearly better. And I just wouldn't put too much stock into that statement. You know, I think Hennessy wound up being the 2nd center taken in his draft class. And one wonders if Hennessy would have been in this draft class, would he have been taken ahead of Dalman, who was the 6th center taken in this draft class? And maybe Hennessy would have been the 6th or 7th, 5th, 6th or 7th center taken this year as opposed to last year. And maybe Dalman would have been the 2nd center taken a year ago had he been in that draft class, assuming that, you could time travel. But, obviously we have a potential battle brewing between those two guys, and they're sort of going to have to come in and duke it out to win the starting center spot in that vacated spot for Alex Mack. And we'll talk about Drew Dalman's strengths and weaknesses and compare and contrast in some ways him with Hennessy and how he stacks up against that player. And maybe that by the end of today's episode, I'll be leaning one particular way on where I think that battle will be headed. But before we get there, guys, of course, I have to plug the NBA side of the Locked On Podcast Network, where, of course, the NBA playoffs are ongoing, including many of your beloved Atlanta Hawks. Check out the Locked On Hawks podcast hosted by Brad Rowland, wherever you get your podcasts. Credit Karma Money is a brand new checking account where you can win cash reimbursements for making purchases. When you use your Credit Karma Money debit card, you can win daily instant Karma purchase and reimbursements on items up to $5,000. Just pay with your debit card, and if you win, you'll be notified on the spot and your instant Karma cash will be added back to your spend account. Credit Karma Money has already given away over $3 million in instant Karma to over 50,000 Credit Karma members and counting. Open your FDIC insured spend account for free. There's no minimum balance requirements, no overdraft fees, and free withdrawals from a network of over 50,000 ATMs. Right now, visit creditkarma.com/winmoney to open your free account and start winning instant Karma. Go to creditkarma.com/winmoney to sign up for free and start winning instant Karma. That's creditkarma.com/winmoney. Instant Karma is sponsored by Credit Karma. No purchase necessary. Exclusions and terms apply. See rules. Banking services provided by MVB Bank Incorporated, member FDIC. Maximum balance and transfer limits do apply. Finding the right parts for your roster takes time and patience when it comes to this draft process, but it's not so hard to find the right parts for your vehicle because there's a simple place to do so, and that's, of course, rockauto.com. They have everything from engine parts, motor oil, new carpet, brake parts, tail lamps. You could get anything you need in just a few easy clicks delivered directly to your door. And the rockauto.com catalog is unique. It's easy to navigate, and you can quickly see all the parts available for your vehicle. Choose by brand, specification, and price that you prefer. And those prices at rockauto.com are always reliably low. The same for professionals and do-it-yourselfers. Why spend up to twice as much for the same parts? Go to rockauto.com right now. See all the parts available for your car or truck. Write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So in evaluating Drew Dalman, I watched about 65% of the 6 or so games that he played this last year in this truncated 2020 season. I did go back and watch a few of his starts in 2018 and 2019 to sort of monitor and evaluate his growth from previous years till now. And, you know, the main thing that jumps out to you with Drew Dalman is the athleticism. He played in a scheme at Stanford that was, you know, heavily outside zone based. So in terms of seeing the types of blocks that you want to see in a prospect, it's a clean, easy evaluation. He checks those boxes, whether it's making the reach blocks, climbing to the second level, being that heat-seeking missile that we talk about, taking out linebackers. Again, Dalman checks all those boxes. He's by no means the best in that regard that I've ever seen, but he's generally very good there. The only issue, it comes to making those blocks in space. For whatever reason, he was not nearly as effective on screen passes, and he seemed a lot less adept hitting his assignments in those situations. But certainly, I think he has the tools in the skill set to get better there. You know, the other thing that stood out in a positive way was Drew Dalman's hand usage. And I think he benefits somewhat from having very large hands, 10.5 inches, which I think is the 94th percentile for centers and 85th percentile for offensive linemen over the last 20 years. And while hand size isn't necessarily the end all be all, but it is something that I think, like, when you see it reflected on film, you're like, oh, okay, this means something, but it doesn't automatically mean, oh, a player can do this, is the point I'm trying to make. But I think in Dalman's case, it is reflected in film because you're looking at sort of grip strength. It is meaning that, like, once a guy gets his hands on you, he can lock on and you're not going anywhere. And I think that's probably one of the things that does stand out with Dalman, that he does a really good job locking on, particularly in the run game. If you can recall on my Hennessy scouting report a year ago, I talked about when it came to him in the running game and on making those blocks on the second level and being that sort of heat-seeking missile trying to take out linebackers, that Hennessy didn't do a great job taking those linebackers out. And the analogy I use, that if Hennessy's a missile, he's damaging the targets, not necessarily outright destroying them. And I think Dalman is much more likely to destroy his targets because of his ability to lock on and then finish that defender into the dirt. So I think Dalman's upside as a run blocker is a little bit higher than Hennessy's was. Now let's talk about a little bit of the concerns you have with Drew Dalman. First, you know, the one area where I do think Hennessy does outshine Dalman is in snapping. I noticed a couple of times watching in 2020 this past year that Dalman had some low snaps, and that did lead to some issues for the Stanford offense. Now, I don't think it was a big issue for Dalman. And from what I saw watching Hennessy a year ago, it was a non-issue for him. But it is one of those things where you notice, I think, 3 or 4 times where he has a low snap, and 280 plus snaps this past year, that, you know, that's roughly 1% of the time. And that's a similar ratio to what you saw with Mike Person in 2015 on like 900 plus snaps. But I'm sure, as many a Falcon fan will tell you, like, it was an issue, even if snapping was good, you know, 98.5 to 99% of the time. And, you know, even though I said then when it came to Mike Person, and I'll say it now with Drew Dalman, you know, I don't think it's going to make or break your offense, but potentially in a close roster battle, it could wind up being a tiebreaker. So I do think it's something to note that Drew Dalman will possibly have to improve upon. You know, but I think the main issue that you look at Drew Dalman's game is the same issue that you had with Matt Hennessy's game, which is his ability to hold up against power and size. Now, the benefit of being a center versus playing any other position on the offensive line is that you get far less one-on-one blocking assignments, right? Typically, you only have to really worry about a center going up one-on-one against a classic 3-4 nose tackle. And, you know, I remember back in the day, going way back with Todd McClure, you know, during his playing days, the heyday of his playing days in the early 2000s, most of the 3-4 teams in the NFL at that time were AFC teams. So it was like, if you were an AFC team, you needed an Alex Mack, a bigger, more physical center, in order to be an effective offensive line. But you could get away with having a smaller, you know, 300-pounder like Todd McClure in the NFC. And the Falcons, for the most part, were able to do so outside of the handful of sort of crossover games that they would have with the AFC. And, you know, that doesn't necessarily fly as much in today's, because 3-4 teams are all over the place. And frankly, most teams are running some version of like hybrid fronts. And you see that in the Falcons' own division in the NFC South, where you have big time physical nose tackles like Vita Vea and Derek Brown. Obviously, the Falcons have plenty of 3-4 teams on their schedule this year, like Dallas and Washington and Giants, etc. So you're not going to be able to escape that issue, if it is an issue, in today's NFL like you could 10 or 15 years ago when Todd McClure was playing. And so I think the concern is, and that was the concern and is the concern with Matt Hennessy, I think it could cause problems for Drew Dalman moving forward. Bigger, more physical defensive tackles, when they get those one-on-one situations against Dalman, they could take advantage of him, push him around, really collapse the pocket. And that's not ideal, particularly with a quarterback like Matt Ryan, who needs that sort of clean pocket in order to step up into and have those clean throws. Now, ideally, you hope, okay, well, if he's going to struggle against Vea and Derek Brown, outside of those 4 games that he gets a year, he'll be able to, be functional in that regard. But that's a big question mark. And if he can, then it's not a major concern outside of the divisional games. But you wonder if those sort of top shelf power pigs, as they're often called, are going to give a guy like Drew Dalman significant problems, and whether or not he's going to be able to hold his own against the rest of the guys that he faces. So it's a concern, and I think it also limits his potential as a guard, which is the same issue we talked about a year ago with Matt Hennessy not projecting well there. But I do think Dalman might project a little bit better as a guard and be a little bit closer to being functional as a guard than in comparison to Matt Hennessy, because it goes back to the athleticism, and it's not just that ability to, move in space that you're looking for in the run game, but when it comes to how his athleticism and particularly his hand usage applies in pass protection. The thing I noticed with Dalman watching the film is he has a similar thing that Jake Matthews and Matt Gano have that I've talked about in the past, which is that athleticism to recover and reset, right? It's that they might get knocked back upon initial contact by the defender, but they're able to sort of recoil those hips, reset their hands, and they have the sort of physical flexibility that actually gives them actual flexibility when it comes to pass protection, because essentially they're getting 2 bites at the apple with every rep, because if their technique doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, because they can reset, right? And they can get a second opportunity upon that initial contact. And I didn't really see that with Hennessy when I evaluated him a year ago, and certainly in his limited opportunities that he played in 2020, you didn't necessarily see that. If he got beat off the initial, contact, the initial move, he got beat last year in his limited opportunities. So we'll have to sort of see how that goes. And that notion, that with Jake Matthews and Matt Gano in particular, because those are 2 guys that aren't necessarily known for their power, right? And from time to time, they will get pushed around by power rushers. We've seen that the last couple of years. And obviously, we don't have as big a sample size with Matt Gano, but for the most part, Jake Matthews, we do. And for the most part, even though we see from time to time Jake have some rough outings against more powerful pass rushers, for the most part, looking at his entire body of work, he has more good. The good far outweighs the bad when it comes to his ability as a pass protector. I feel like similarly to Jake Matthews and Matt Gano, like that ability to get pushed around initially is problematic, but I think those guys have the ability to recover. And I think maybe for Drew Dalman, like it is with Jake Matthews and Matt Gano, his issues in pass protection may not be as problematic for him as it would be for a similar player in Matt Hennessy, who may not have that ability to sort of reset and recover. So with that being said, we'll move on and wrap up today's episode by talking about Drew Dalman's floor, his ceiling, and then his eye level in terms of giving us NFL player comparisons on sort of projecting what type of career and season Drew Dalman's will have in the coming years. But before we get there, guys, already plugged the NBA side of the Locked On Podcast Network, but I got to give love to the MLB side of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can find a daily podcast devoted to your favorite Major League Baseball team, including the Atlanta Braves. Check a Locked On Braves podcast out on Odyssey or wherever you get your podcasts. So BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your sports action, and it gives you the latest news, odds, and info for all your sporting needs, including Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, and all your UFC and MMA action. And there's no time like the month of June to get started at BetOnline. The NHL playoffs, the NBA playoffs, the French Open have already started. You got the final leg of the Triple Crown, the Belmont, later this week. And of course, baseball season is in full swing, and you can track all the action at BetOnline. And it's not just sports. BetOnline even covers awards, TV shows, and reality TV. Get real-time updated odds and props on almost anything you can imagine. Just head over to the website or use your mobile device to sign up today at betonline.ag. Use the promo promo code Locked On to receive a 50% welcome bonus with your first deposit. That means if you deposit $200, you get $100 and free money to play with by using that promo code Locked On for your 50% welcome bonus. Bet Online, your online sportsbook experts. So we're talking about the floor, ceiling, and eye level. And if you're unfamiliar with what these terms mean, to me, a floor is what a player is tomorrow. So if we had to play an NFL game tomorrow, this is what I think Drew Dalman is going to be. Ceiling, obviously, is where I think his maximum potential, if all things go well for him, this is where the player I think he could potentially be. And then the eye level is the halfway point between those 2 points where the probability is much higher that he will wind up coming closer to hitting that eye level than it is necessarily reaching that ceiling, so to speak. So for me, the floor for Drew Dalman is Mason Cole, the 3rd round pick out of Michigan in 2018 with the Cardinals. He started as a rookie with the Cardinals when their starting center A.Q. Shipley got hurt. Then Shipley came back in 2019. Cole became backup. Then Shipley was allowed to walk in free agency in 2020, and then Cole got the chance to be his replacement as a starter. And in both years as a starter, in 2018 as well as 2020, was not very effective as a starter. And then that prompted the Cardinals to go out there and acquire Rodney Hudson, arguably the best center in the league, and then traded Mason Cole to the Vikings this past offseason for a 6th round pick. And that, for me, is the starting point for Drew Dalman. You know, similarly, if he was forced to start as a rookie, I could see a scenario where he struggles similar to Mason Cole. You know, Cole struggled in pass protection, especially early in his rookie season over those first 4 or 5 games with the Cardinals in 2018. And then you look at the Falcons 2021 schedule, and coming out of the gates, he's got Javon Hargrave in week 1, Vita Vea week 2, Danny Shelton week 3, Deron Payne week 4. So it's not a easy lineup to sort of ease your way into the NFL if you're Drew Dalman, and especially if you're struggle against more powerful nose tackles. I think the issue with Dalman handling size could be a problem for him coming out of the gates, similar to what we saw with Cole back in 2018. And, even this past year, you didn't see the growth from Mason Cole with his second year as a full-time starter, as he remained one of the least effective pass protecting centers in the NFL based off of Pro Football Focus grades, in large part due to that inability to deal with sort of size and quickness. And, you wonder, similarly with Dalman, similar to Cole, and given a couple of years of development in Arizona, if he doesn't necessarily show that growth that you're looking for, would the Falcons be in a similar situation like the Cardinals were looking to upgrade that spot with one of the top centers in the league, like the Cardinals did with Rodney Hudson, because they weren't willing to sort of roll with a guy that is continually a subpar starter. And so I think, Dalman certainly has the potential to overcome that floor and be better than that floor. But it wouldn't completely shock me if that's sort of what we're seeing, where we're on a similar timescale of 2 or 3 years, where it's like, okay, now we really got to, fix the center position a couple of years down the road. So, I think Dalman certainly has the ability to overcome that. And looking at his ceiling, the players I picked were David Andrews, who the Falcons were interested in, or at least rumored to be looking at in free agency this past year before he ultimately re-signed with the Patriots. Andrews was originally an undrafted free agent out of Georgia back in 2015, started as a rookie for the Patriots, was pretty solid that year, in large part, right? He was a starter as a rookie, similar to Cole, where it was due to an injury to incumbent starting center Brian Stork, who was a 4th round pick the previous year, and Stork got hurt. Had some concussion issues that forced Andrews into the lineup his rookie year, and Andrews did a solid job. Then Stork sort of re-won his starting job back by the end of the season, but didn't necessarily impress all that much, coupled with his injury issues. I read an article or two where Stork got into a couple of fights the following summer when he was competing with Andrews for that starting center spot, and didn't have the same level of consistency that they wanted with Andrews, and coupled with the sort of concussion issues that led to the Patriots, rolling with Andrews. They tried to trade Stork that summer. He failed his physical with Washington because I believe the concussion things, and then wound up retiring, never played another down in the NFL. And I think now he's like an assistant coach in college or whatever the case may be. And Andrews, meanwhile, never looked back and has been one of the above average to good centers in the NFL, in large part thanks to being coached by the greatest offensive line coach in Dante Scarnecchia. We talked about Alex Gibb earlier. If there's two assistant offensive line coaches deserving of being in the Hall of Fame, it's Alex Gibbs and Dante Scarnecchia. While I won't necessarily put those same expectations on Dwayne Ledford, he certainly has a good reputation, but I'm not going to expect him to be able to coach up guys in the same way that Scarnecchia did many, many times over, multiple decades in New England. But Andrews, similar to Dalman, is a guy that doesn't have the greatest size, and you see that show up from time to time, but for the most part gets by because he's an athletic center. He's able to overcome that issue, has that similar mean streak that Dalman has. He's not going to create a ton of push, but I think some of it is owed to the fact that the Patriots have routinely put good guards around David Andrews, so he doesn't necessarily need that with guys like Shaq Mason and Joe Thuney in recent years. And so, the better guards that you have around your center, if he's not going to sort of be that one-on-one pile mover, if you have guards that can do that a little bit better than he can, then that sort of makes up for that deficiency there. The main issue with Andrews in his NFL career has been injuries similar to Stork, where he had some blood clots in 2019 that caused him to miss that entire season, that put his career back in jeopardy. But he did come back this past year in 2020 and played pretty well. He's not an elite center, but consistently grades out in the top 10 to 15 centers in the NFL. It's an above average to good starter. And I kind of think that's where Dalman's ceiling is. He's not going to be an elite guy, but he certainly should be an above average to good center, has some limitations, but for the most part, they're not going to show up too often. He's not going to be a dominant player, but he's going to be a solid player. Now, I mentioned sort of the players I looked at his ceiling, and there was another player that I was very tempted to compare Dalman to and use as his ceiling was Corey Lindsley. And the main reason I didn't is because this past year, Corey Lindsley was Pro Football Focus's highest graded center. And even though for the previous 5 or 6 years that he was a starter in Green Bay, Lindsley graded out much more similarly to a player like Andrews as a top 10 to 15 guy, a good but not great center. But I didn't want to put those expectations on Dalman and compare him to what was, at least this past year, the best center in the NFL and have those expectations wind up people thinking, oh, this guy has the potential to be one of the best, the best center in the NFL. And then we saw with Lindsley that took until year 7 for him. And we saw similarly with Alex Mack, where in 2016, that was his 8th NFL season. So it's possible. I certainly would not dismiss it that, 7 or 8 years down the road, Drew Dalman might be considered one of the best centers in the NFL. But, we're a very long way away from that. And you need to have several solid years, to put together prior to that where you would feel like that's a possibility. So for me, trying to find that eye level, that halfway point between his floor and his ceiling, the player I wound up settling on was Austin Blythe, who is currently in the mix to start for the Chiefs at the center spot, formerly with the LA Rams. Blythe was originally a 7th round pick with the Colts in 2016. Early in his career, he was sort of cross-trained as a guard and center. Was cut after 1 year by the Colts, scooped up by the Rams, saw some reps early on, similar to what he did as a rookie with Indianapolis, playing both center and guard. Then in 2018, Jamon Brown, you guys might be familiar with him, got suspended, and Blythe got the bulk of the reps in Brown's stead and played so well for the Rams that year that the Rams decided, okay, well, we don't need Jamon Brown anymore. He wound up going to the Giants to finish that 2018 season, and then I forget where he landed in 2019, but I don't know. Blythe had a solid 2018, even though, like these other guys that we're talking about, he was an undersized guy, had some limitations in pass protection, but really was not any more limited than what Jamon Brown, even though Brown, probably has like 40 pounds on him, wasn't any more less effective or than Brown was the previous year before replacing him. But then 2019 happened for the Rams offensive line, and they had a bunch of injuries, and they were constantly moving guys in and out. And then they switched Blythe midseason from the right guard spot that he had manned to the center spot, which was his collegiate position at Iowa. And, you guys, I'm sure, can recall the narrative a year ago that when the Falcons picked up, this guy by the name of Todd Gurley, and a lot of people wanted to believe that Todd Gurley was due for a big rebound season. And a lot of the reasons why they felt that way is because they blamed his lack of production in 2019 to how horrid the Rams offensive line was. And it was a bad offensive line. And, Blythe didn't do much to sort of help that regard. But this past year, he remained as the center and had a nice bounce back, solid year. He graded out as Pro Football Focus's 13th highest graded center. Signs with the Chiefs this past offseason in their offensive line revamp to sort of upgrade over Austin Reiter. And now he's set to compete with their second round pick in Creed Humphrey. And Blythe signed a 1-year deal. And you imagine because of the value that the Chiefs put in Humphrey will probably be their long-term solution and probably win that starting job this year. But I wouldn't necessarily count Blythe out completely. I'm also infamously, I guess, not a huge Creed Humphrey guy. So I wouldn't necessarily be totally shocked if Blythe wound up starting for the Chiefs week 1, but we'll see how that goes. And I think ultimately where Blythe is as a player, where I think Drew Dalman will ultimately be in terms of his eye level is a serviceable, to good starting NFL center. And Blythe was a better fit as a center than a guard due to those issues that we've talked about already with Dalman and other players in terms of not having the size to really hold up in pass protection, ideally like you want in a guard. And Dalman does have some experience playing guard. He had the 2 starts in 2018. And as you would expect, at least watching one of those starts from that year, he did have some struggles against Oregon and the power that they had at some of those D-tackle positions. But I do think, as I mentioned earlier, he'll probably hold up a little bit better than Hennessy. But I don't think that's, in Dalman's case, going to be his long-term position. And similar to Blythe, you might start him for a year or so at that spot, but feel like you can do a much better job at that spot and really ideally the center position. And unlike the Rams, who had a long-time veteran like John Sullivan at that center spot. And of course, that's one of the reasons why they didn't move Blythe to that spot until after Sullivan left. But I feel like the situation the Rams found themselves in with Austin Blythe is similar to the situation the Falcons had with Ben Garland a couple of years ago in 2017 and 2018, where they had to play Garland as their guard due to injuries and whatnot. And Garland was okay, but was very up and down in that time frame. And there were certainly some very rough games for Garland where his limitations got exposed, but somewhat was able to compensate with really good run blocking, being that sort of heat-seeking missile in the Falcons' outside zone run scheme that they continued to run in those years. And I feel like Dalman would be destined for a similar thing, where it's like you can get by with that. And we've seen it in last years with Garland being in San Francisco. He's been a much more effective starting center, filling in for Weston Richburg these last 2 years, and he was the starting center on that Super Bowl team a couple of years ago. And like Blythe, like Garland, you're not going to necessarily look at those guys at center and be like, oh, these are long-term solutions, as we've seen with the Rams and now the Chiefs. Neither one of those teams have been willing to commit long-term to Blythe, and Garland has not, obviously the 49ers went out and signed Alex Mack. Right, they went out and got Weston Richburg, and so they saw Garland more as a good backup than necessarily a high-level starter. And you could argue that the Chiefs presumably see the same thing with Austin Blythe, and that may be what Drew Dalman ultimately winds up being. Serviceable to good if he winds up being a starter, but may widely be considered more of a high-level backup than necessarily a high-level starter. And so, getting to the final point, if you were asking me today who I would be willing to bet on starting more games for the Falcons at the center position over the next 3 years between Drew Dalman and Matt Hennessy, I would probably bet money on Drew Dalman. But again, it gets back to the point we're talking about where I don't know if after that 3-year period of time, you're going to feel like, oh, this Drew Dalman guys, when we get to his second contract, in 2024, 2025, are you going to feel compelled to be like, yo, this is going to be the guy that is going to be our long-term solution? I don't know if Drew Dalman's going to be that player. I think he can be, but I feel comfortable. I feel confident projecting him as a stopgap option for the center position, but I don't feel as confident projecting him in the same way of a Corey Lindsley or even a Todd McClure, who's a similar player, but wound up starting for 13 years here in Atlanta. But like, I wonder, for me, a lot of it may be, and this is the thing that I'm interested in, whether my bias is making me feel a lot more optimistic about Drew Dalman, because I'm much more pessimistic about Jalen Mayfield. And I wonder, like, is that my brain trying to compensate and being like, do I really like Drew Dalman, or do I just like him in comparison a lot more than I like Jalen Mayfield? And so that's one of the interesting things that I'm curious to sort of see if 3 years from now we're looking back at this and like, yeah, I was probably a little too high on Drew Dalman, and that was because I was so low on Jalen Mayfield, and I just wanted to be high on a Falcons offensive lineman, and that's sort of my bias coming out. Or if we look back and say, like, no, legitimately you had every reason to be high on Drew Dalman because he far exceeds his eye level and is on that sort of Corey Lindsley, David Andrews path to become one of the better centers in the NFL 3 years from now. And so obviously time will tell. We don't know the answer to that. You know, obviously the part of this process is to have a range of expectations. And, you know, as we go through preseason this year, and then we see what growth Dalman shows between year 1 and year 2, assuming he isn't the starter, and we see what growth he has during the regular season, you know, we'll have to adjust our expectations accordingly, you know, up or down. And like, oh, well, Dalman came out and played much better. You know, that floor of Mason Cole was too low, or maybe there's a chance that floor of Mason Cole might be a little too high on Drew Dalman. So, you know, we'll just adjust according, and that's just the nature of the beast. But, you know, I think Dalman is a good player. You know, I don't know if he is massively better than Matt Hennessy, but I do think he is better than Matt Hennessy. And I would sit here and say that while I'm not necessarily convinced that he'll be the week 1 starter, I think, you know, coming out of the draft, I was like, oh, there's probably like a 65% chance that Hennessy starts and a 35% chance that Drew Dalman starts. Now I kind of feel like it's closer to 50-50, and sort of the thing that will determine, you know, who wins the job kind of will be dependent on like who's healthy this summer. Like, it's those things that can kind of be the difference between a guy winning or losing a job, where it's like, oh, you tweak your ankle and you miss a week of practice, that's going to give an edge to the other guy. So like, I feel like now going into the summer, it's much more 50-50, having sat down and watched more of Drew Dalman than I did immediately, you know, draft weekend. So it's kind of a toss-up. It's kind of a coin flip for me at this point in time, and I'll be curious to see, you know, who wins that job. You know, that's it for today's scouting report on Drew Dalman. We still have, 4 more guys left to evaluate, and we'll get to those guys in the coming weeks. But before we get into that, I do want to plug the Locked On Today podcast. You know, I got you covered on all things Atlanta Falcons. Who's got you covered for the rest of sports? And there's so many sports going on right now. And that's, of course, the Locked On Today podcast hosted by Peter Bukowski. He's got all the sports news that you need every morning in under 20 minutes. Subscribe to the Locked On Today podcast on the Odyssey app or wherever you get your podcasts. So, guys, there you have it with Drew Dalman. You know, I think there's a lot of similarities between him and Matt Hennessy. But again, I think it's kind of a toss-up between who wins that starting job. I feel like Dalman's the better player, but, you know, it's tough to come in and be that, you know, opening day starter as a rookie. You don't see that very often. It's usually circumstances that prompt, as I mentioned with guys like Mason Cole and David Andrews, like they came in and started because guys got hurt, right? So we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. But tomorrow's episode will be a Q&A episode. So if you're looking to submit questions to be answered on tomorrow's episode, of course, you can do so via Twitter at Locked On Falcons, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons, or you can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Appreciate it, guys. Until then.